my name is Trevor Warren, and this is my 1971 Chevy Nova. So, my dad and I bought this car. This actually was my very first car. We bought it when I was 14, back in 1999. I wasn't really looking so much for a Nova, but my dad was a car guy, always had muscle cars, always had, fast cars and everything like that. So when I got of age, we started looking for just some sort of project, and I fell in love with the Nova body style almost immediately. We looked at some other cars, I thought they were great, whatever, but we found, I remember, a 1972 Chevy Nova with an inline six, and I just thought that that was the coolest car that I had ever seen. So he, being a car guy, wanted to find something with a V8. So we ended up looking for quite some time and finally found something 2 hours away in Seattle, and had it trailered over in January of 1999 in the snow. And I'll never forget the day. We pulled it into the garage, and I immediately went to work cleaning all the snow off, cleaning all the slush off, and giving it its new home. And so it's been with me, aside from my stint in college down here in Arizona, it's been with me for the better part of 21 years now, 22 years now. So when we first acquired it, it actually had this paint. It was yellow like this. It was, for the most part, intact. The bumpers were off. I think I had to buy a new bumper for the back. The interior was in boxes, so we had to completely redo the interior. Windshield was broken, so we replaced the windshield. Transmission needed to be rebuilt. We replaced all the soft parts on the car. It hadn't been driven for a couple of years. But that really kicked off kind of a mini restoration, at least. And shoot, I don't know, I mean, a long-term, I guess, restoration to the point where you kind of see where it is now. So my initial intentions were to make this into a daily driver. Thankfully, I lived in the east side of Washington, so it was a fairly mild climate. Didn't need AC like we do here in Arizona. In the wintertime, I didn't drive this at all. But yeah, initially it was going to be a daily driver. But my dad is a drag racer, an old school drag racer. So we kind of quickly started turning up the wick. I remember I was actually racing a guy. We probably didn't even hit 80 miles an hour because it had a 307 originally in it. And I blew a rocker arm. And my dad used that as an excuse to buy a 350, which was a 12-second motor. So we essentially quickly made it into a pretty decent race car for a high schooler. That included a fuel cell. That included Art Morrison ladder bars in the back, and it included, some drag racing, Mickey Thompson ET street slicks, kind of the whole nine. Made it into a pretty quick straight line car. So when I first started building the car, forums weren't a big thing. So the influences that really influenced my build were a lot of the magazines, Super Chevy, Popular Hot Rodding, those types. The pro touring movement really hadn't even started at the time. So a lot of guys were still focused on pro street, on going fast in a straight line. It wasn't until I started the LS swap around 2008 that I started getting more into the forums. And the internet's a beautiful thing for information. So you see guys that are building kind of some different things. You see guys that have wider front tires, that aren't running Mickey Thompsons in the back and skinny tires up front or something like that. And from there, you really find a lot of different builds, and so you get kind of a lot of different spices that are thrown in to influence what you start building. So it was shortly after I finished the LS swap where I turned my build thread for just the LS swap itself on LS1 Tech into essentially a full car build thread where I would throw in, when I did wheels and tires, when I did brakes, when I did suspension mods, anything like that. And I noticed a lot of guys were doing that. And also mentioning, some other forums, Lateral G, Steve's Nova site obviously is a big one for the Novas, Pro Touring obviously as well. So you kind of start to dabble, into some of those other forums, and you broaden your horizons even more. And that's where you really get to see, what some guys are doing with their cars, and really how far people are pushing the envelope in terms of how big of tires they can fit, or how big of brakes they can fit, or how fast they can go around some cones. as opposed to just going in a straight line. And so that really influenced my build in the past maybe 10 years or so, to go from a strictly straight line car to something that's not only able to go fast in a straight line, but also able to turn and able to go on the street, and is a much more comfortable car than what it was when I first started the LS swap. So, some of my goals with the build, doing the LS swap, obviously the power and the convenience of having fuel injection is a very big one. You can sneeze on these motors and make 500 horsepower, so that was very appealing to me from the beginning. In terms of, the suspension and the interior and wheels and tires and brakes and everything, I've always tried to focus on making it a touring car first and making it reliable. There have been a lot of times that I've failed in that because I've definitely broken down a few times, but for the most part, I want this to be a car that I feel comfortable driving up to LS Fest West, in Las Vegas, driving over to Del Mar for Good Guys or something like that. And I've finally gotten to the point, I believe, where I can actually do that. So I'll begin, taking some more road trips once we can actually get out and interact with people in person a lot more. But that's always been kind of what I've focused on is, not just the convenience, but the reliability and a bit of the comfort, being able to, take off on the car and know that I'm going to make it from point A to point B, and I'm also going to be relatively comfortable as you could be in a 50-year-old car. So I had the 350 for about 10 years or so, and I would build on that for a while in iterations, making it faster and faster. It was about 2007, 2008. I was out of college, had some money in my pocket, so I was perusing Craigslist one day, as one is wont to do, and just happened upon a 6-liter truck motor with a 4L80E transmission for $1,200. So I jumped on it. Little did I know that both of those needed to be completely rebuilt, so I cut my teeth fully rebuilding an engine for the first time and teaching myself how to rebuild an automatic transmission as well. Those really helped me understand the engine and the transmission and everything that goes into a drivetrain. So after rebuilding those, naturally I wanted to keep the fuel injection because I liked the idea of not having to tinker on a carburetor any longer. So I needed to do some wiring. So I taught myself how to rewire the car. And that just kind of snowballed. From there, I took the entire front end of the car apart because it looked pretty tired. Had everything on the front end powder coated, all the frame and the interior parts and things like that of the engine compartment, had those powder coated, cleaned everything up, rebuilt the front suspension, and took about 18 months and finally had a running LS swapped 71 Nova. So I drove it for a couple of years just like that, and there was just something missing. So I happened to be perusing the LS1 Tech classifieds one day and saw a guy in Florida who had a T56 for sale or for trade. He was looking for a 4L80. So a couple of direct messages later, and I shipped him a 4L80 and he shipped me a T56. We made a clean swap. So I went about adding a third pedal to the car, which was both the most rewarding and possibly the most infuriating thing that I've done to the vehicle that I would probably never do again, but I'm glad that I did it. So a couple of years later, I was working on a VW Combi for a friend of mine, and one of his friends who happened to be there, he and I got to talking, and turns out he was an LS guy as well. He happened to have an LSA supercharger sitting at his shop that he'd sell me for $500. So it's close to my birthday, and I used that as an excuse to jump on it. That swap took the better part of, I think, 9 months or so. I had to make some custom parts for that, including a tensioner bracket for the LSA and the 6-rib tensioners, as well as a bracket for my air conditioning compressor. That swap made 575 horsepower and 566 foot-pounds of torque on the dyno after all was said and done. And that's how she sits today. The car's running American Racing headers with 1 7/8 primaries and 3-inch collectors, flowing through 3-inch Pipes exhaust using the Pipes Race Pro mufflers. I didn't have room to run the exhaust all the way out the back, so it dumps right in front of the back tires. So it's a little bit loud. Some people love it. I've certainly gotten some people that have yelled at me for it, but I definitely love the sound. It's running a quick ratio power steering box from Sweet Manufacturing, tubular control arms, and QA1 coilovers. I'm also running first-gen Camaro Z28 steering arms. Now those are shorter than the standard power steering arm, and the reason I did that was so I could move the outer tie rod end in and be able to clear the barrel of the wheels. I plan on running 11-inch wide wheels and 315s up front to be 315 square. So that's going to allow me to have a bit more clearance to be able to run those wheels. The car started off life with monoleaf springs. I quickly replaced those with an Art Morrison ladder bar setup, which was great going in a straight line. And actually I got a lot of compliments from folks when I was autocrossing with it. They said the car was just absolutely flat through corners and people wanted to know how that was. I didn't have the heart to tell many folks that it was because the rear suspension was binding and didn't allow the car to actually move very much through turns. So I was driving down the road one day, I hit a bump and heard just an absolutely massive clunk. Quickly pulled over and checked underneath the car to see what it was, thinking that maybe I hit a rock or something like that, and my oil was spilling everywhere. But it was actually the front cross member for those Art Morrison ladder bars had ripped itself off of the subframe connectors. And the only thing holding it together was the fact that my exhaust was under it. That was the only thing holding it on. So I limped it home. I was only about a mile from home. And a friend and I, we welded it back together and strengthened it a little bit. And I immediately got on the phone with Speed Tech, called them and asked for a torque arm setup. I'd heard nothing but good things about their torque arm. I saw a lot of guys running those at Good Guys and at autocross events. And so I knew that I was gonna want something that was a bit better, especially on the street and even on the track, than those ladder bars were. And I can't say enough good things about it. It was dead simple to install, other than a little bit of welding that we had to do, which wasn't terribly difficult at all. It took the better part of a day probably. And yeah, the car drives just absolutely amazing with that rear suspension setup. So when I was in high school, there was a guy with a pretty nasty 10-second 70 Nova, and he gave me an Eaton posi unit and 390 gears. Unfortunately, I had an 8.2-inch 10 bolt, and those were for the corporate 8.5-inch 10 bolt. So my dad and I set off to the junkyard to find an axle that would fit, and we actually found one out of I believe it was a 76 Cadillac. Couldn't tell you what model it was, but we rebuilt that and stuck it in the back. So right now it's running an 8.5-inch 10 bolt with 390 gears and an Eaton posi unit. I'm sure that the axles are probably not long for this world with 575 horsepower, but I'm not going to try it out with any sticky tires or anything like that anytime soon. For For the brakes, I'm running C6 Corvette Z51 fronts with custom brackets that I made to fit. And then out back, I'm running 4th gen Camaro brakes, which actually were a straight bolt-on for the 10 bolt. Wheels are from TSW. I'm running 18 by 8 up front with a 1-inch spacer. That gives it about 15 millimeters of offset. And I did that because I needed to fit the 245/40 front tire up there. It does actually still kiss the frame every once in a while at full lock, but that's about the best that I could do with those tires. In the back, I modified the wheels to be 11 inches wide. They're 18 by 11, running 315/30 tires. I have about 55 millimeters of offset there with a small spacer to make those fit. The car came from the factory in Placer Gold, I believe is what it was called. It was painted before I bought the car in this color yellow that you see here. I don't actually know if it's a factory color from any manufacturer or anything like that. And even when the car was backed into by an old Ford F100 back in high school and we had the front end repainted, they didn't actually give me a paint coat or anything like that. I've had the Harwood knockoff 2-inch cowl hood on the car for probably about 20 years. I actually needed to do some modifications to it in order to fit the supercharger. Funny enough, my buddy and I, we fiberglassed the inside, or the underside of the hood rather, to make a custom cowl intake for the LS before I had the supercharger. And then as soon as I bolted the supercharger on, all that fiberglass work we did had to come out because it hit the hood. The car has Corbeau GTS2 seats. I created custom brackets to drop those as low as possible onto the floor pan. It also has gauges from Speed Hut. I actually took inspiration from Singer. The 911s reimagined by Singer, who have the tack a different color from the rest of the gauges, and I love that look. The center console and seat belts are actually out of a Dodge Neon. The center console fit perfectly with zero modifications. It's quite popular with Nova guys. And surprisingly, the seat belts fit pretty well too. I had a friend that created a custom bracket that bolts into the stock upper mount location for seat belts. And in the back, I actually created some custom brackets out of metal plate for the rear seat belts as well. It's got vintage air. I cut holes in the dash for the vents and fit the vents to essentially mimic what a stock AC Nova dash looks like. Steering wheel is from Grant. I actually got that as a Valentine's Day gift from my high school sweetheart. The carpet, the dash pad, the headliner, and the interior panels have all been replaced as well. And the trunk has custom panels that I designed and built that hide the battery. I wish I would have done the front end right the first time. I've probably had the thing apart maybe 6 or 7 times in the past 10 years or so. And I still need to finish that up. I'd also think more about making the car more reliable and more streetable from the start. I've had to undo a lot of things that I either custom made or had cut or something like that, which has resulted in a bit of a pain for me down the road. So essentially just thinking things over before I start cutting and before I start building. I definitely do a lot more of that if I were to start this build over. The next major change is going 315 square. So I'm going to run 11-inch wide wheels up front, see what interferes. Probably going to have to make modifications to the stock subframe in order to make those fit. But that's the next big modification. And from there, you can always use more horsepower. So maybe some E85 or something like that. So now that I've essentially gotten it to the point where I feel that it's reliable, I'm going to start driving it a lot more and taking it on a lot more road trips. So it'll probably be in town here in Phoenix at first, then stretch my legs out a bit, head up to LS Fest West in Vegas, head over to Good Guys Del Mar. I've got a few friends in California that autocross over in California, so I'd love to just drive it out to California, do an autocross, and hopefully drive it home. But that's the goal, is to get it to be a not just an autocross car, but a touring car as well. The vast majority of people absolutely love it. I'll be at a gas station People will come up and talk about how they had a, you know, whatever year Nova back in the day, and they sold it for pennies, and they wish they would have never gotten rid of it. And then I tell them that this was my first car, and that just absolutely cracks people up. They absolutely love it. You know, having really loud exhaust and having a, you know, super aggressive car, I do get some people that either flip me off or give me a scowl or something like that, but it's few and far between. Actually, far fewer than I would anticipate here in 2021. More importantly though, my 9-year-old twins absolutely love this thing. They love the smell of gas, they love the smell of the exhaust, they love the sound of the car. Me being a protective father, I always try and get them to, you know, put earplugs in or something like that whenever we take it out, but they absolutely refuse because they just love to hear the sound. They love the visceral feeling of, you know, the exhaust bouncing off the ground and rumbling and all of that. So I'm really excited to see if they, you know, become gearheads when they get older. Some of the folks that really helped make this a reality, Frojo and the Bandit, two Nova guys that also did LS swaps around the similar, you know, time frame that I did. Both those guys' builds and actually their input, we've talked a lot. Their input has been instrumental in getting this car where it sits today. In addition, my buddy Dewey here in Phoenix, he's a master fabricator. So whatever crazy ideas I've cooked up, that guy essentially has been able to weld things together for me. Otherwise, this car would probably be sitting in Swiss cheese and not be running whatsoever. And also my dad and my stepdad, both those two were instrumental in getting me here where I'm at today, and also getting this car where it is today. Without those two, I wouldn't be a gearhead, and quite frankly, I would have never become an engineer. I would have never you know, realized how much I love working with my hands and how much I love mechanical bits and bobs, and probably never would have pursued a career in engineering. So I would definitely love to thank both of those guys for making this not just a car, but making it a passion for me and making it something that I truly feel is my happy place and feel is something that defines me as much as it you know, defines essentially just being a project car. You can follow my build on Instagram at LSXBODY, and I even sometimes post videos to YouTube also under LSXBODY.